In front of dozens of employees in the lobby, a black single father in a worn suit rushed forward to catch an old man in rags whom the security director had shoved to the floor for blocking a VIP client's path. When Rebecca Collins shouted for both of them to be dragged out, saying men like them did not deserve to walk into her building, Lucas Carter stepped in front of the old man and answered, "If you want to throw someone out, throw me out first." Nobody knew the old man was the billionaire CEO's father. The suit Lucas Carter wore that morning had been tailored 9 years earlier, back when a tailor was something he could afford. The shoulders still fit. Everything else about it announced exactly how long he had been out of the industry, and he knew it before he ever reached the revolving doors of Harrison Global's headquarters on the west side of the financial district. He had left operations management 4 years ago after a family matter that ended the way those things usually end, quietly and permanently, and without leaving him anything to point at afterward. He had been a single father since then, and there was nobody else in the household to absorb another year like the one he had just finished. Colleagues stopped calling. Recruiters stopped answering. A resume with a 4-year gap in it read to most hiring managers. Like a confession they did not have time to hear the details of. He had learned something else about that gap in 4 years of interviews, which was that it did not sit on his resume the way it sat on other men's. He had watched 2 former colleagues with the same gap and the same title walk back into work inside of 8 months. He had stopped mentioning it to anyone because there was no way to raise it that did not sound like an excuse, and a man who sounds like he is making excuses does not get a second interview either. The interview at Harrison Global was the 11th he had scheduled that year and the first one that had gotten past a phone screen. He had rehearsed his answers in the parking garage for 40 minutes. He had learned the company's supply chain restructuring by heart, all 3 phases of it, including the parts the press releases had glossed over. He arrived 50 minutes early because being early cost nothing. The lobby of Harrison Global was built to make people feel small in a way they would describe later as impressive. 60 feet of white stone, a water feature along the north wall that made no sound, and a reception desk so wide it required 3 people to staff it. The elevator banks were sealed behind glass turnstiles that read employee badges and rejected everything else. At that hour, the floor was full. Analysts crossing toward the coffee bar, legal staff carrying folders, 24 people in the reception queue waiting for visitor passes, the kind of crowd that notices everything and remembers none of it. Jonathan Harrison, who ran the company, was not among them. He was rarely among them. He had taken the chair 15 years earlier and had built a reputation across the industry for being scrupulously fair and almost entirely invisible. He did not do internal town halls. He did not appear in the onboarding videos. Most of the 1,100 employees in the tower had never seen his face outside of a photograph on the corporate website, and that photograph was 6 years old. His father, Richard Harrison, had founded the company in 1987, and had run it for 23 years before walking away at an age when most men in his position were still fighting to hold on. He had given no farewell address. He had never granted a magazine cover. The founder's portrait that once hung in the lobby had come down during a rebranding replaced by a sculpture nobody could explain. So when Richard Harrison came through the doors that morning in a canvas coat with a torn pocket, wearing shoes he had owned for a decade and carrying a paper bag, not a single person in that lobby recognized him. That was, in fact, the entire point. He had made a habit of it since the year he left. Twice a year, sometimes 3 times, he walked into one of his son's buildings dressed like a man nobody would want to look at, and he watched. It was the only reliable way he had ever found to learn what a company actually was, as opposed to what it said about itself in its annual report. He moved slowly toward the far end of the lobby past the water feature and stopped near the corridor that connected the visitor queue to the elevator banks. He was not obstructing anything. He was standing in a public space in a building his own name had built, watching how people treated a stranger who looked poor. The answer that morning arrived quickly. Rebecca Collins had run security at Harrison Global for 6 years and had turned the position into something considerably larger than the job description. She controlled the badge system, the camera network, the guard rotations, the contractor access lists, and by extension a great deal of what happened inside the tower on any given day. She reported to the chief administrative officer, who had learned it was easier not to ask her questions. She had a client arriving at 9:15. The client was a board member's associate. The visit had been on her calendar for a week, and she had made it known to her guards that the arrival was to be immaculate. She saw Richard from 30 feet away and made her assessment in under 2 seconds. "Sir." Her voice cut across the lobby with the flat authority of someone who had never once been challenged in that room. "This is private property. You need to leave." Richard turned toward her without hurry. He looked at her badge, then at her face, and he said quietly that he was waiting for someone. "You're not waiting for anyone." Rebecca closed the distance. Two guards drifted in behind her without being asked. "You're loitering in a corporate lobby and you're standing directly in the path of a client who arrives in 10 minutes. I don't know how you got past the doors. I'm not interested. Move." Conversations in the lobby thinned out, not stopped thinned. People angled themselves so they could watch without appearing to watch, which was its own kind of participation. Richard said he would step aside, and he began to. He was not fast enough for her. What happened next took less than a second and was seen by roughly 40 people. Rebecca put her hand on his shoulder and pushed. It was not a shove that a security professional would ever describe in a report as a shove. It was the kind of contact that ends with an old man's paper bag splitting on white stone and an old man's knee striking that same stone hard enough that the sound carried to the reception desk. Richard Harrison went down onto the floor of the lobby he had commissioned in the 1990s. Nobody moved. That was the part he would remember afterward more than the pain in his knee. 40 people, and every one of them found something else to look at. A young analyst near the coffee bar took half a step forward and then took it back. Two women at reception looked down at their monitors. A man in the visitor queue turned his body 90 degrees physically, removing himself from the sightline. They were not cruel people. They were people who had mortgages and who understood without ever being told that the woman standing over the old man could end their employment before lunch and would face no consequence for doing it. "He's fine," Rebecca announced to the room. "Everybody carry on." Lucas Carter was already moving. He had been sitting on the visitor bench with his portfolio on his lap 40 minutes early for an interview he had spent 3 days preparing for. He had done the arithmetic before he was fully out of the seat, and the arithmetic was not complicated. He was the only black man in that lobby who was not wearing a uniform. He had no badge, and the woman standing over the old man ran every camera in the building. Whatever version of the next 10 seconds got written down afterward would not be his version. He crossed the lobby, fast went down on one knee beside Richard, and got a hand under the old man's arm. "Don't stand up yet," he said. "Give it a second. Tell me where it hurts." Richard looked at him. It was the first time in 15 years of doing this that anyone had reached him before the guards did. Lucas got him upright slowly, taking most of the weight himself, and steadied him until the old man's balance came back. Then he collected what had fallen out of the paper bag, which was a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and a folded newspaper, and he handed them back without comment. Only then did he turn to Rebecca. "You put your hands on him," Lucas said. "He's twice your age. He wasn't blocking anything. You need to apologize to him." Rebecca looked at the worn suit, at the portfolio still lying on the bench, at the visitor lanyard he had not yet been issued. She looked at him for a beat longer than she had looked at the old man, and something in her face settled into a conclusion she had reached before he finished speaking. "Excuse me. You heard me. And who exactly are you?" "I'm here for the 9:30 interview. Operations." Lucas kept his voice level, which was somehow worse for her than shouting would have been. He kept his hands where the guards could see them, which was a thing he did without deciding to do it. "That's not relevant to what just happened. You knocked down an elderly man in front of 40 witnesses. Apologize to him." The lobby had gone properly silent now. Rebecca had spent 6 years building a position where nobody spoke to her that way, least of all a candidate who did not yet have a badge in front of an audience that would repeat every word of it by lunchtime. "Get them both out," she said to her guards. "Now! People like you two don't belong inside this corporation." Lucas moved so that he was standing between the guards and Richard. "If you're throwing someone out," he said, "throw me out first." One of the guards, a heavy man in his 50s named Thomas Reed, stopped walking. He looked at Rebecca, then at the old man, and did not close the last 6 feet. "He's an applicant," Reed said. "He hasn't done anything." "He's finished," Rebecca said. "That's what he's done." She turned to face the room, and she said it loudly enough that the reception desk heard every syllable. "He's disqualified, effective immediately. Strike him from the schedule and flag him in the system. He does not come back into this building." Lucas felt that land somewhere under his ribs. 10 interviews before this one. 4 years. 3 days of preparation. Gone in under 90 seconds, and he had known it would go that way from the moment he crossed the lobby floor, and he had crossed it anyway. He did not argue. He picked up his portfolio and stood beside the old man and waited to be walked out. The doors on the executive elevator opened. Jonathan Harrison had landed at 6 that morning from 9 days abroad, had come directly from the airport with a garment bag over his shoulder, and had intended to be at his desk before anyone noticed he was in the country. Instead, he walked into a lobby where nobody was talking and where his security director was standing over a man he had recognized the moment the elevator doors opened. He did not react to that recognition, not by a single degree of expression. What's happening here? The room turned. Most of them did not know who he was. The ones who did went very still, and the stillness spread outward from them until it reached Rebecca, who understood a half-second later exactly whose voice she had just heard. "Mr. Harrison," she recovered fast, which was one of her genuine skills. "A trespasser in the lobby, handled, and a candidate who chose to make a scene about it. I'd like to hear it from all three of you." He heard Rebecca first. She described a vagrant in the client corridor, a refusal to comply, a minimal physical redirect, and a job applicant who had inserted himself into a security matter and behaved aggressively toward a director. She used the word aggressively twice, and both times she said it without appearing to notice she had said it. He heard Lucas second. Lucas described what he had seen without adjectives. He did not mention the interview or the 4 years or what it had cost him to cross that floor. He did not mention the word she had used twice either, though he had heard it land. He described the push and the fall and the fact that nobody else had moved. Then Jonathan turned to his father, standing there with a torn coat pocket and a split paper bag, and asked him if he wanted to add anything. Richard Harrison looked back at his son and said only that the young man had been the one to help him up. There was a moment there, less than a heartbeat, where Jonathan could have ended the entire thing. He could have said the words that would have emptied that lobby of every certainty it held. He looked at his father, and his father looked back, and something passed between them that not one person in the room could read. Jonathan chose the silence. He had returned from 9 days abroad carrying a folder of internal audit flags that he had not shown to anyone in the building, and 3 of them traced back to the department standing in front of him. He had been circling Rebecca Collins for 4 months without enough to move on. If he said what his father was right there in front of 40 witnesses, every camera file and every access log in her control would be clean by nightfall. So he said something else. "Miss Collins, you disqualified a candidate." "I did. His conduct was, hiring decisions in operations aren't yours to make." He said it without heat, which made it land harder. "Mr. Carter, is it? Your interview is reinstated. You'll go through the full process, every stage." Lucas said that he understood. "One change." Jonathan looked at him for a moment longer than the moment required. "If you're hired, you'll report through operations, but I'll be reviewing your work personally, directly. Every deliverable comes to me." That produced a small movement across the lobby. The chief executive did not supervise mid-level hires. The chief executive did not supervise anyone below the executive floor. "Sir," Rebecca said, "with respect given what I witnessed, you witnessed an applicant help an elderly man off the floor of my lobby." Jonathan let that sit. "Escort the gentleman out if he'd like to go, politely, and get him medical attention if he needs it." He turned and walked back toward the elevators. Richard declined the medical attention. He told the guard Reed that he could manage, and he walked out through the revolving doors on his own, slowly, with his newspaper under his arm. At the doors, he stopped and looked back at Lucas one more time, and neither of them said anything, and then he was gone into the street. Lucas Carter did his interview at 9:30 in a glass room on the 14th floor. He answered every question about throughput modeling and vendor consolidation, and the third phase of the restructuring that the press releases had glossed over. 2 of the 3 interviewers had already heard about the lobby before he sat down. He could see it in how carefully they avoided mentioning it. He got the offer 4 days later. Operations manager, distribution and logistics, reporting into a director who had been told in writing that this particular hire's work would be reviewed at the top. Down on the ground floor, Rebecca Collins sat in the security operations room with the camera archive open on the wall in front of her, watching the lobby footage from 9:10 in the morning for the 4th time. She watched herself put a hand on an old man's shoulder. She watched him go down. She watched one man in a bad suit walk straight across the marble into the middle of it while everybody else studied the floor. She had run security in that tower for 6 years. She had built a system that answered to her and nobody else, and she had done that for reasons she had never written down anywhere. And she had gone 6 years without a single person inside the building looking too closely at any of it. Now, the chief executive of Harrison Global had personally overruled her in front of the entire lobby on the word of an unemployed man with a 4-year gap in his resume and had attached that man's name directly to his own. Rebecca closed the file. Whatever Lucas Carter was, he was now a problem inside her building. She had handled problems before. Lucas Carter's badge activated on a Monday in March, and by Wednesday he understood that the badge was the only thing about the building that would work in his favor. The distribution and logistics floor sat on level 970 people across an open plan, and on his first morning, exactly 2 of them said hello. One was a scheduler named Karen Mitchell, who said it quickly and then found a reason to be elsewhere. The other was a data analyst named Ethan Brooks, who said it looked around and then said it again more quietly. The lobby story had reached level 9 before Lucas did. In the version that traveled, a candidate had humiliated the head of security in front of the entire ground floor and had somehow been hired anyway, with his work routed straight to the chief executive. Nobody on that floor knew what to do with a man like that except stay away from him. There was a second version, which did not travel through the corridors, but through the smoking area and the parking garage and 1 or 2 of the quieter group chats. And in that version, the interesting question was how a man with a 4-year gap had walked out of that lobby with a job at all. Lucas heard it once secondhand from a scheduler who did not realize she was repeating it to him. He filed it where he filed everything else that year, which was nowhere he would have to look at it before 8 in the morning. Rebecca Collins did not need to explain her position to anyone. She simply began using the parts of the building that answered to her. The first thing to go was his access. Operations managers held clearance to the warehouse management platform, the carrier portal, and the vendor contract archive. Lucas's badge opened the first 2. The third returned a permissions error that took 17 days and 4 tickets to resolve, and when it finally cleared, the archive had been reorganized so that documents were filed by internal reference number rather than by vendor, which meant that finding anything required knowing in advance what you were looking for. The second thing was the work itself. Security signed off on any project touching the loading docks, the freight elevators, or contractor movement inside the tower, which in a distribution operation meant nearly everything. Rebecca did not block his projects. Blocking would have been visible. Instead, she approved them late-requested clarifications on clauses that had not changed in 4 years and returned documents at 4:50 in the afternoon on Fridays with a note that a revision would be needed before Monday's deadline. Then came the assignments that were designed not to be finished. In his 3rd week, Lucas was handed the Corbin Street Depot reconciliation, 18 months of inventory variance across a site that had changed warehouse systems mid-year without migrating the historical records. 2 people had been given the task before him. Both had escalated it. Both had been reassigned within a month. His director, a tired man named Daniel Whitaker, who had learned not to fight battles he could not win, handed it over with an apology already in his voice and a deadline of 14 days. Lucas took it without argument and worked it the way he had once worked things when he still had a career. He rebuilt the variance file from the carrier manifests instead of the warehouse system because the manifests had never been migrated and therefore had never been corrupted. It took him 9 days. He found $400,000 of phantom shrinkage that was not shrinkage at all, but a duplicate posting rule that had been running unnoticed since the system change. The report went up on a Tuesday. On Thursday, it came back down through the operations bulletin under the name of a senior analyst on level 11 with Lucas's methodology intact and his name absent. Whitaker told him privately that these things happened and that he would note it internally. Lucas thanked him and said nothing else about it and went back to his desk and understood precisely what he was being taught, that his work would be taken from him, that his mistakes never would be, because the mistakes were counted with a care that nothing else in that building received. A transposed digit in a draft routing schedule corrected by Lucas himself within the hour appeared 8 days later in a compliance summary as a control failure with potential downstream exposure. A meeting he attended remotely because a site visit ran long was logged as a non-attendance. A vendor call that ended in disagreement was documented by security, who had no reason to be documenting vendor calls at all, and the documentation described his tone. Every one of those items went into a file, and the file went to the executive floor because Jonathan Harrison had said in the lobby that he would review this man's work personally, and Rebecca Collins had decided to make certain he reviewed all of it. Lucas knew what was being built. He could not prove a single piece of it, and he made a decision early and held to it. He would not complain upward. He would not go around Whitaker. He would put his head down and do the work correctly every time and let the record be whatever it was going to be. He knew what the other road looked like, too. He had watched a man he used to work with take it at a previous employer, and he had watched how quickly the conversation stopped being about the thing that happened and started being about the man who raised it. There was no version of that road where Lucas arrived at the end of it still holding the job. There were mornings in the parking garage when that decision cost him something to make again. He had been out of the industry for 4 years, and he had spent all of it learning what it felt like to be a man nobody would take a chance on. He had one chance now. It came with a woman above him who wanted him gone and a floor of 70 colleagues who had decided that standing near him was a professional risk. He made the decision again anyway every morning, and then he went upstairs. Richard Harrison came back to the tower in April. He came the same way he always had in the old canvas coat through the doors on a weekday morning, and this time he stayed near the loading bay entrance on the east side rather than the lobby. He was not there to test the building. He was there to test one man because he had spent 15 years watching how people behaved when they believed nothing was at stake, and in all that time, exactly one person had crossed a marble floor to help him, and Richard Harrison wanted to know whether that had been character or an accident. The first test was small. He was sitting on the low wall outside the freight entrance at 12:30, and he asked Lucas, who was crossing to the depot with a folder under his arm, whether the shelter on 9th Street was still open because he had heard it had closed. Lucas stopped. He did not know. He said he would find out, and he sat down on the wall with his phone and called 2 numbers, and the second one told him that the 9th Street facility had closed in January and that the nearest replacement was 14 blocks north. He wrote the address down on the back of a page from his folder and handed it over. He also handed over half of the sandwich he had brought from home without making any observation about it, and then he went to the depot. He was 19 minutes late for the depot walkthrough. It was logged. The second test came in May and was not small. The night cleaning supervisor was a woman named Margaret Doyle who had worked in the tower for 19 years and who was found on level 9 at 7 in the evening sitting against a wall by the service elevator, gray in the face, saying that she was fine. Lucas was on that floor because he had a call scheduled with a carrier in Rotterdam at 7:15, a call that had taken 3 weeks to arrange and that Whitaker had told him was the single most important item on his plate that quarter. He got Margaret Doyle down to the street and into an ambulance and rode with her to the hospital because there was nobody else to ride with her, and he sat in the corridor until her sister arrived at 9:40. The Rotterdam call did not happen. The carrier's operations lead was not available again for 5 weeks. Rebecca Collins had the incident written up before the ambulance had left the block, and the write-up described an operations manager who had abandoned a critical commercial commitment, and it did not mention the ambulance at all. Richard Harrison had been standing across the street when the ambulance doors closed. He had seen who got in. He went to see his son that night. Jonathan's apartment was 40 minutes north of the tower, and he had not been home before 10 in 3 weeks. The two of them sat in the kitchen and had the argument they had been circling since March. Richard said that the man had been in the building 9 weeks and had been robbed of a report buried in unwinnable work and written up for helping a woman who could not breathe, and that his own son was sitting on the executive floor reading every one of those write-ups and doing nothing. He said one other thing which he had not planned to say and did not repeat afterward. He said that he had read the write-ups, too, because Jonathan had left them on the counter, and that he had been in business long enough to know what a file looks like when it is being assembled about a particular kind of man, and that he had seen files like that in his own company in 1994, and had told himself the same thing his son was telling him now. Jonathan told him what he had not told anyone, that the internal audit flags he had carried back from abroad had grown into 14, that all of them traced through the security department's contractor budget, and that Rebecca Collins personally controlled the camera archive, the access logs, the badge system, and the vendor approvals that would constitute the entire evidentiary basis of any case against her. That if she understood she was being examined, all of it would be clean inside of a day, and that 6 years of it would go unanswered. Richard said that was a reason to move faster, not to wait. Jonathan said it was a reason to wait, and that he did not like it, and that he was not going to explain himself twice. His father asked him what he thought Lucas Carter was exactly in that arrangement. Jonathan did not answer that. What Jonathan did instead was the thing the whole floor would talk about for the rest of the month. The Corbin Street reconciliation had gone up the chain under a senior analyst's name, and Jonathan Harrison had read the original file because he read everything that came through with Carter's name attached, and he could see the difference between a document written by a man who understood carrier manifests and a document written by a man who had received one. At the quarterly operations review in the second week of June in front of 240 people in the auditorium on level 3, Jonathan put the reconciliation methodology on the screen and said whose work it was. He said that $400,000 of phantom variance had been sitting in the books for 18 months, that 2 prior attempts had escalated and closed without resolution, and that the approach that solved it had come from the operations manager who had been in the building for 13 weeks. He said the name twice. He said that the methodology would be adopted as the standard reconciliation protocol across all 4 depots. Then he said that anyone who submitted another person's work under their own name would be terminated and that the senior analyst on level 11 had been dismissed that morning, and he moved to the next slide. Lucas sat in the 8th row and did not move for the remainder of the presentation. For the first time since March, people on level 9 spoke to him in the corridor. Karen Mitchell asked him about the manifest approach and stayed for the whole answer. Ethan Brooks stopped lowering his voice. Whitaker sent him a 2-line message that said he had been right to note it internally and that he was glad it had landed. It should have been the safest moment of his tenure. It was the moment that ended it. Rebecca Collins had sat in the 4th row of that auditorium and had heard underneath everything the chief executive actually said the one sentence he did not say out loud. That the reconciliation protocol Lucas Carter had built from carrier manifests was going to be rolled across all 4 depots, and that every one of those depots ran contractor labor through the security department's budget line, and that the man building the protocol would be reading original source documents for every dollar that moved through them. She had spent 6 years constructing a set of arrangements that only survived because nobody compared the paperwork to the reality. 14 contractor invoices a quarter for services staffed at half the billed headcount, a guard company whose owner had never once been asked to competitively rebid. A camera maintenance contract renewed at 40% above market since 2019. None of it survived a manifest reconciliation. She stopped thinking about Lucas Carter as a humiliation to be repaid and started thinking about him as an exposure to be closed. She took 9 days to do it properly. On the last Friday in June at 6:40 in the evening, a package of vendor contract files was exported from the archive to an external drive using Lucas Carter's credentials from the workstation at his desk on level 9 while badge records showed him inside the building. He had been inside the building. He had been in the east stairwell at the time, walking down from a depot planning meeting on level 11, and the stairwell camera had been offline since a maintenance window in May, which was a fact Rebecca had confirmed before choosing it. The following Tuesday, an anonymous compliance report arrived flagging the export. Rebecca opened a formal security investigation within the hour, which was procedure, and which put her in charge of collecting every piece of evidence in it, which was the point. The lobby camera footage from that Friday evening showed Lucas Carter leaving the building at 6:52 with a bag he had not carried in that morning. He had. It contained a laptop charger and a pair of running shoes. The level 9 floor camera showed a man at Carter's workstation at 6:40. The image was poor, the angle was high, and the timestamp was clean. It showed a black man of roughly the right height in a dark shirt, and Rebecca had understood when she selected the frame that nobody on the committee was going to ask a second question about it, and she had been correct. Both files were pulled by the security director, personally exported to the disciplinary package, personally, and submitted with her signature. The disciplinary committee convened on a Thursday in early July. 6 members, Legal Human Resources Compliance, 2 operations directors, and Rebecca Collins. Whitaker asked whether anyone had checked the original server archive rather than the exported copies. Legal answered that the exports had been certified by the security director. Whitaker asked who certified the security director. Nobody answered that, and the meeting continued. Lucas was given 10 minutes to respond. He said he had not made the export. He said he had been in the east stairwell. He said the badge log would show his movement between floors and asked for it to be pulled. The badge log for that evening, the committee was informed, had been affected by a system fault and was unavailable for the relevant window. He was asked directly whether he was accusing anyone in the room of falsifying evidence. He looked at the 6 of them for a moment, and he thought about Whitaker, who had asked the only real question in the room and would pay for it. He thought about Ethan Brooks, who had run a timestamp comparison on the two camera files at midnight without being asked, and who had a wife and a lease and no protection at all. He thought, too, about what would happen to every word he said after the one he was being invited to say. He knew the shape of that conversation. It stopped being a conversation about a file and became a conversation about him, and it never came back. He said that he was not accusing anyone. He said he had not done it, and that he would cooperate with any investigation the company wanted to run, and that he would not speculate about how the files came to look the way they looked. The committee voted 5-1. Richard Harrison, who had spent that week in the building more openly than he had in 15 years, told his son on Wednesday night that he was finished waiting and that he would walk into that lobby and end it. Jonathan asked him to hold until noon on Thursday. He said that his general counsel was 12 hours from a preservation order on the original camera server, that the moment Richard spoke, Rebecca would have those 12 hours to erase everything, and that 6 years of it would burn with her. His father asked him what half a day would cost the man on level 9. Jonathan said he knew exactly what it would cost. He said he had known since March. He said that he was going to have to live with it either way and that he would rather live with it and have her. Richard agreed to noon. He did not make it to noon. At 9 o'clock on Thursday morning, on the ground floor of Harrison Global, in front of the reception desk and the water feature and 300 employees arriving for work, Rebecca Collins had Lucas Carter brought down from level 9 and suspended in the open. She read the finding aloud. She used the word fraud. She said that the individual had been placed in the building over the objection of security, that the company had been deceived, and that his access was revoked effective immediately. 2 guards were instructed to escort him from the premises. Thomas Reed, who had stopped 6 feet short of an old man in March, took Lucas's badge and did not look at him while he did it. Nobody on that floor spoke. Not Whitaker, not Karen Mitchell, not Ethan Brooks, who stood at the back with the timestamp comparison on a drive in his pocket and did nothing with it. Lucas Carter stood in the middle of a lobby he had crossed once for a stranger and found 4 months later that the arithmetic had not changed. An old man in a worn canvas coat walked out of the elevator bank past the guards into the center of the floor. He stopped beside Lucas. He looked up at the executive mezzanine where his son was standing at the rail, and he spoke loudly enough that the entire lobby heard him. "Son, it's time to end this." 300 people stood in the lobby of Harrison Global and watched a man in a torn coat call the chief executive of the company his son. Jonathan Harrison came down the mezzanine stairs. He crossed the floor to where his father stood, and he stopped beside him, and he addressed the room in a voice that carried without effort. "This is Richard Harrison. He founded this company in 1987. He ran it for 23 years. He has been retired for 15, and in every one of those 15 years, he has come into this building twice a year, dressed exactly the way you see him now, because it is the only way he has ever found to learn what a place is actually like." The silence that followed had a different quality to it than the silence that had come before. In March, he was standing near the client corridor. He was pushed to the floor in front of 40 people. Jonathan looked at the reception desk, and at the coffee bar, and at the visitor queue. One person crossed that floor to help him. He was disqualified from his interview for it. He is standing here this morning being escorted out of the building for fraud. Rebecca Collins had not moved since the old man spoke. She was still holding the printed finding. "Miss Collins." Jonathan turned to her. "Your investigation is suspended. Your access is suspended. Surrender your badge and your credentials to legal, who are behind you." 2 attorneys from the general counsel's office had come out of the elevator bank while he was speaking. Rebecca said that she wanted a lawyer present. "You'll have one," Jonathan said. "You'll need one." He turned back to the room and then to Lucas. "Mr. Carter's suspension is void. His access is restored as of this moment. He is not going anywhere." Thomas Reed handed the badge back with both hands and could not look at him doing it. The preservation order that Jonathan's general counsel had been 12 hours from on Wednesday night was executed at 11:15 that Thursday morning. It covered the primary camera server, the redundant array in the basement, the badge access database, the vendor contract archive, and every device the security director had touched in 6 years. Rebecca Collins was walked out of the building at 11:40 without having had the opportunity to open a single file. What came back off those servers over the following 9 days did not merely clear Lucas Carter. It took the company apart. The floor camera on level 9 had been altered, The forensic team retained by the board found the original file intact in the redundant array because the redundant array had been written to a system Rebecca did not control, a fact she had never verified because in 6 years, nobody had ever asked her to produce an original. The original showed a man at Carter's workstation at 6:40 on the last Friday in June. The man was not Lucas Carter. He was a contractor from the guard company, badged in under a maintenance credential that Rebecca had personally approved that afternoon. The forensic report noted in a single line that the board read twice that the two men shared no distinguishing feature beyond build and complexion, and that the identification had never been tested by anyone at any stage of the process. Ethan Brooks brought them the drive on the second morning. He had run the timestamp comparison in June. He had carried it in his pocket into that lobby, and he told the forensic team exactly what he had done with it, which was nothing. He asked that his statement be recorded in full, including that part. It was. The badge log that had suffered a system fault had suffered nothing. It was complete. It placed Lucas Carter in the east stairwell between 6:36 and 6:44, moving from level 11 to level 9 exactly as he had told a committee that had voted 5-1 against him. And once the forensic team was inside the vendor archive with a preservation order and no reason to stop, they found what Rebecca Collins had spent 9 days in June trying to prevent anyone from finding. 14 contractor invoices a quarter submitted every quarter since 2019 billing headcount that had never been on site. A guard services contract that had rolled over 6 consecutive times without a competitive bid held by a company registered to a man who had been in business with Rebecca Collins before she was ever hired at Harrison Global. A camera maintenance agreement priced 40% above market since 2019, renewed every year by the person responsible for auditing it. 6 years. The number the board eventually put in front of the shareholders was $2.1 million. It did not stop at her. The senior analyst on level 11 who had submitted the Corbin Street reconciliation under his own name had not acted alone, and nobody in the company had thought to ask what else he had signed in the 4 years before it. A director in facilities had approved 9 of the contractor invoices without reading one. A compliance officer had closed 3 separate anomaly flags in 2022 after a conversation with the security director that he had never logged. And under all of it, the disciplinary committee that had voted 5-1 had done so on evidence certified by the only person in the room with a reason to falsify it, and not one of the 5 had asked to see an original. That was the crisis, and Jonathan Harrison understood its shape before anyone on the board did. The company had not been damaged by one corrupt director. It had been damaged by 6 years of a culture in which nobody asked the question that would be uncomfortable to ask. Daniel Whitaker had asked it once into a silent room and had been answered with nothing at all. The board convened an emergency session on the last Monday in July. 2 members argued for containment, a quiet settlement, no filing, no disclosure. Jonathan told them that the company would refer the matter to the district attorney's office in full, would disclose it in the quarterly filing, and would publish the findings internally to every employee. He was asked what that would do to the share price. He said he was more concerned about what 6 more years of silence would do to the company. The vote went with him 8-2. Rebecca Collins was terminated for cause referred to prosecutors and charged in September with wire fraud and falsification of business records. The guard company's owner was charged alongside her. The facilities director and the compliance officer were terminated. The senior analyst from level 11, already gone, was named in the referral. 4 members of the disciplinary committee received formal findings of failure in their permanent files, and 2 of them resigned within the month rather than sit through the review. The 5th member, Daniel Whitaker, who had cast the only dissenting vote, was named to the working group that rebuilt the company's evidentiary standards. On the first Friday in August, 4 weeks after the morning in the lobby, Jonathan Harrison stood on the mezzanine again with the entire headquarters staff assembled below and on video from all 4 depots. He did not have notes. He said that in that lobby, the company had suspended an employee in public for something he did not do, and that it had done so on evidence the company itself had manufactured, and that the failure was not the security directors alone. He said that he had been told about the falsified write-ups, the buried assignments, the stolen report, and the incident file about an ambulance, and that he had read every one of them, and that he had chosen to wait because he was building a case he was afraid of losing. He said that the decision had been his, that it had cost a man 4 months of his life and his reputation inside the building, and that he was not going to describe it as strategy. He said one more thing, and he said it slowly because he had written it out 3 times the night before and had thrown all 3 away. He said that a photograph too poor to identify anyone had been used to identify a specific man, and that 6 people had accepted it, and that he did not believe every one of those 6 had been acting in bad faith. He said that was the part the company was going to have to sit with because bad faith can be fired, and the other thing has to be built out. Then he said the rest of it looking directly at the 8th row where Lucas Carter was sitting. "Mr. Carter, I owe you an apology, and I'm making it here because this is where it was taken from you. I'm sorry." Nobody applauded because nobody knew whether it was the kind of moment where you applaud. What happened instead was that the auditorium stayed completely quiet for 4 or 5 seconds, and then Karen Mitchell stood up in the 6th row, and then Ethan Brooks stood up at the back, and then Daniel Whitaker, and then it moved through the room in a way nobody organized. Richard Harrison spoke after his son, which he had not done inside that building in 15 years. He was not wearing the canvas coat. He stood at the rail in a plain gray suit, and he told them that he had been walking into their buildings dressed like a man nobody wanted to look at since the year he retired, and that in all that time exactly one person had ever helped him. He said that a company could hire competence anywhere, and that what it could not hire was a man who behaved the same way when nobody was watching, and there was nothing in it for him. He said that the man who crossed the marble in March had done it carrying a portfolio for an interview he had waited 4 years to get, and had known before he took the first step what it was going to cost him, and had known it more precisely than anyone else standing in that lobby. He said that he did not blame the people who had stayed where they were, because they had understood correctly what the building would do to anyone who intervened, and that this was the finding, and that it belonged to management. Jonathan offered Lucas the position of chief operating officer that afternoon in the office on the top floor with the general counsel present because the board had already ratified it. Lucas did not accept it. He said that 4 months earlier he had been an unemployed operations manager with a 4-year gap and 10 failed interviews behind him, and that if he took the second largest chair in the company a month after helping the founder off a lobby floor, then every person in that building would know exactly what he had been paid for, and so would he. He said that there was a second version of that sentence that would follow him around the building for as long as he held the job, and that he was not going to hand it to anyone for free. Jonathan told him that he had assumed he would say something like that. Then he put 3 documents on the table. The Corbin Street reconciliation rebuilt from carrier manifests in 9 days after 2 prior attempts had escalated and closed. The depot protocol built from it, which by then had recovered $1.4 million across 4 sites. And the performance file that Rebecca Collins had assembled to destroy him, which the forensic team had gone through line by line, and which contained once every falsified entry was stripped out. The record of a man who had delivered every assignment he was given on time while being obstructed at every access point in the building. He said that the file Rebecca Collins built had turned out to be the strongest case for the promotion that anyone had ever assembled, and that she had assembled it herself. He said the position was not a reward for what happened in March. He said that if it had been, he would have offered it in March. Lucas Carter read the 3 documents, then he signed. Harrison Global's operations reform began that autumn and took 18 months. It did not start with the loading docks. It started with the one thing Lucas had learned on level 9, which was that in that building, an ordinary person had no way to raise an objection that did not go through the person they were objecting to. He built the reporting channel first routed outside the chain of command to an external firm, with the results going to the audit committee rather than to management. He put a rule in the disciplinary code requiring that any evidence used against an employee be produced from an original source, certified by a party with no interest in the outcome, which was Daniel Whitaker's question written down and made permanent. He added a second rule that took longer to get through the working group, which was that no identification of an employee from camera footage could be entered into a disciplinary file without a corroborating access record. He was asked in the session whether that was necessary given everything else they had put in. He said that it was the only rule on the list that would have saved him, and the working group stopped asking. He rebid every contract in the security department, and the camera maintenance agreement came back at 43% below what the company had been paying since 2019. He also went back through the incident files from the spring and had the write-up about the ambulance corrected on the record, and Margaret Doyle, who had returned to work in September after a stent and 8 weeks of recovery, was the one who asked him why he had bothered. He told her it was the only entry in the file that had never been about him. He put the founder's portrait back in the lobby, which had been down since the rebranding, and he had the March incident summary framed beside it. 1 page. The whole thing, including the 40 people who did not move. Some of the board thought that was a mistake. Jonathan overruled them. Within 2 years, Harrison Global was being written about for something other than its logistics network. Business schools sent people to look at the evidentiary standard. 2 competitors adopted the reporting structure outright. Turnover on the distribution floors fell by 1/3, and the exit interviews stopped citing fear as a reason for leaving, which had been the second most common answer in 2022, and which nobody in management had ever read. Karen Mitchell ran the Corbin Street Depot by then. Ethan Brooks led the data team that built the manifest reconciliation into the core system, and he had asked before he accepted it whether his statement to the forensic team had been read by the people promoting him. He was told that it had and that it was part of why. Thomas Reed stayed with the company and trained every new hire in the security department, and he began each session with the same story and did not spare himself in the telling of it. Richard Harrison stopped walking into the buildings in the canvas coat. He was asked once at a dinner why he had given it up after 15 years. He said that the test had only ever measured one thing, which was whether a company would allow a man to be treated badly without anyone objecting, and that his son's company no longer needed measuring. Jonathan Harrison understood by then what he had actually learned in that lobby, and it was not what he had gone looking for. He had spent 8 months building a case against one director because he had believed the problem was one director. The $2.1 million turned out to be the smallest part of what Rebecca Collins had cost the company. The larger part was 6 years of 1,100 people learning that speaking up was for people who could afford it. He had run a company that generated a great deal of profit and had produced in 6 years exactly 1 person willing to cross a floor. That was the number that stayed with him. A leader who builds only earnings has built half a company. Lucas Carter never spoke about the March morning in the years afterward, and when new employees asked him about it, which they did, he told them the same thing every time. He told them that he had not been brave. He said that he had been 35 years old with a bad suit and no career and 1 interview left, and that he had known precisely what crossing that lobby would cost him, and that he had done it anyway for the simple reason that the alternative was becoming a man who could watch that and keep sitting down. He told them one other thing when they asked him the question underneath the question, which some of them did and most of them did not. He said that he had known walking in that the room would read him a certain way before he opened his mouth, and that he had spent 4 years learning exactly how that reading worked, and that in the end, it had not changed the walk. It had only meant that he understood the price better than anybody else in the lobby did. He said that the old man's name had nothing to do with it, that he had helped a stranger in a torn coat, and that if the stranger had been nobody at all, which is what everyone in that lobby believed he was, then the walk across the floor would have been exactly the same walk. Never measure a person by what they are wearing or what position they hold. The one who is willing to defend what is right when no one else will speak is the one who has earned the most respect of all.